Hey, Mark, aside from the fact that your last name is Still and you have that charming Southern accent, why should I trust your whiskey knowledge?
Well, Stacey, that's a great question. So as you can tell, that's not Dan. That's my friend Stacey, and she had a really good question for me. In fact, quite a few really good questions. So I dumped Dan and upgraded to my good friend Stacey. Stacey, welcome to the Practical Still podcast.
Thanks, Mark. It's fun to be here talking with you.
It's going to get funner because we're going to drink.
Yeah, right.
So that question's really good. Why would anybody, not just you, why would anybody trust my whiskey knowledge? And I think the short answer is you shouldn't. It should be a reference point because whiskey tasting, like food tasting, like any other subjective activity, is subjective. So what I like isn't what you might like. But I do think the fact that I do a lot of the heavy lifting for you and that I have 100 and some odd bottles of whiskey sitting in my house at the moment, I have tasted many bottles of whiskey, I think I can be a resource for you. How's that?
That's pretty good. 100 bottles of whiskey means that you've consumed a fair amount of whiskey or are prepared to consume.
I am prepared. I have what I like to refer to as a whiskey buying problem. Not so much, I don't consume it nearly as fast as I accumulate it. But the idea is that even I'm by no means a professional whiskey person, but even professional whiskey people, it is a subjective activity. And so I don't think you should blindly trust anybody, but I do think that there's some basics we can help each other understand. I do think that I can provide some reference points. And then if you listen long enough and you sip some of the stuff I sip or other whiskey people sip, you'll find somebody that you agree with. And at that point, then you can begin to trust somebody. If I tell you that I had a new bottle of whiskey and I liked it because we've had that relationship where we drank some of the same stuff, you might go, okay, well, I believe that. So at that point, I think you should begin to trust me.
I think so. That makes sense. And generally, the first step for me trusting somebody is when they admit they don't know absolutely everything about everything. So, yeah, that's a good place to start.
Not only do I not know everything about, I don't know anything about much on anything. I like whiskey.
Good deal. Me too. But I'm a novice, so I think we need to start with the basics.
Yep. And
I don't even really know what the proper way to taste a whiskey is. So maybe we can start there.
I think we take a step even further back. Okay. You're a novice. Do you know really what whiskey is? Say in relation to rum or wine or...
I'm not a novice drinker. Let's put it that way. And I have actually been to the Jameson factory in Ireland. So I have a little bit of knowledge, but... usually when somebody puts a whiskey in front of me, I sniff it a little and I sip it a little, and that's the most I know how to do.
Well, and that's good. So the idea is that if you do something with whiskey and it's enjoyable, that's the right way to do it.
Okay, great.
There really is no wrong way. I think there's a few things that you can put in practice so that you can fairly judge a whiskey and have a little bit of framework to it. So to that end, that's why I decided that we should both have some Wild Turkey 101 handy. A lot of people will diss Wild Turkey 101 because they had some horrible experience with it in college. But it turns out it's quite the nice whiskey. And I think one of the things that's helpful as you start tasting whiskey, and part of the process of tasting whiskey, is having a baseline whiskey. So over the years, as I've sipped whiskey, Wild Turkey 101 has become my baseline whiskey. It's incredibly affordable, even in today's highly inflated whiskey market. I paid $23 for mine. I don't know what you pay for that one when you bought it.
Yeah, about the same.
Yep. Yeah. So reasonably affordable. But it turns out it is a mixture. Each little batch of Wild Turkey was made up of 6, 7, and 8-year-old bourbons, which is not very young. You can buy some very expensive 7 and 8-year-old bourbons. And the distilling family, the Russells, that have been around Wild Turkey since 1954, they know what they're doing. So I think having a baseline whiskey, it could be anything. Fred Minnick, one of the famous whiskey authors, his is Evan Williams Black Label, the 86 proof plain old Evan Williams. But that will allow you to judge other whiskeys against something you have some familiarity with. So it might take you a year or two to find that favorite bottle you keep around. And you kind of have to do that for each style of whiskey. So we're going to do it with bourbon. But if you get into other styles of whiskey, you might want to have a baseline Scotch whiskey that you judge things against too. I think that's helpful.
Okay.
So
great.
The proper way to, I don't know if it's proper, but here's how I start. Let's open our bottles.
This is the best part.
Isn't it? I like to sniff out of the bottle, which you won't get to do in a bar. But I love the nose.
Depends
out of
how
the
nicely
bottle.
you ask.
That's true. They have let me sniff bottles before. So I like that because it's focused. It's a very small opening on the bottle. That is butterscotchy and sweet and brown
sugar.
It smells
sweet.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So that's a good thing to think about. So it is sweet. So the majority of a bourbon has to be corn. So most of this is corn. In fact, I forget Wild Turkey's exact recipe. In recipes are called mash bills. It has to be at least 51% corn to be bourbon. There's some rye grain in there and some malted barley.
Okay.
The more corn you have, typically the sweeter it tastes, or sweeter it noses and taste. And then we can be a little geeky and look at that's a natural cork. So not a synthetic or a plastic cork.
Okay.
Doesn't really matter, but I like natural corks.
It makes a better noise.
Doesn't it?
Yeah.
And we'll never get that again. You only get that. You get a decent sound, but you never get that perfect sound like when it's fresh open after that first time.
I'm going to do it one more time.
Yeah.
Maybe. Here we go.
And these days we're lucky. Wild Turkey had a history of really bad corks. So they used to break a lot, but they've been a lot better in recent years. Huh. So the next thing we want to do is pour us some whiskey. And do you have a glass handy?
I do.
Cool. I'll do, so I have lots of glasses handy.
Okay.
That's called a rocks glass. Okay. Rocks glasses have heavy bases, typically relatively straight sides. Sometimes they'll tilt out a little bit, but they're straight. Very nice. So we'll pour us a little bit.
That's a very good sound.
It's a very good podcast sound because it's clear what's happening. We're pouring something.
Very dramatic.
One of the tips for, and when we're smelling the whiskey, the whiskey geeks call that nosing the whiskey. So we're nosing. Okay. When we're nosing, if you keep your mouth open a little bit, it helps the vapors, the alcohol vapors kind of pass through a little differently, and you actually can smell it and taste it differently when your mouth's open than when it's closed. It's
sort of a hard thing to do.
It is.
It's surprisingly difficult. Yeah. It's like patting your head and rubbing your belly. But yeah, it does change the amount that you can smell and kind of the intensity of it.
Yeah, so when we pour it, what happens at first is there's a lot of alcohol coming off the whiskey.
Yeah.
And if you keep your mouth shut, that alcohol goes straight up your nose and it makes it hard to actually smell anything.
Yeah. It sure does smell boozy.
Well, it's 101 proof. That's what the 101 in Wild Turkey 101 stands for. The proof is a measurement of the alcohol. It is simply 2 times the alcohol by volume. So usually on a beer or a wine, you're used to seeing some number ABV, alcohol by volume. So this is 50.5% alcohol by volume. But American whiskey tends to use the proof designation rather than the alcohol by volume designation. So after we nose a little and feel good about that, we want to sip a little. And there's again, not proper. I don't know if it's proper or not, but the first sip is going to behave differently on your tongue than the second. So take a tiny little amount, roll it around your tongue, and go ahead and let it go down. Whiskey podcasts have to be one of the few things where it's acceptable to go in a microphone.
Yeah, I'm not used to eating or drinking on camera or microphone. It's sort of awkward. It'll get less awkward the more sips we take, I think.
Absolutely. It's one of the benefits of having a whiskey activity. So that first one, so it comes in on the front of the palate. And it coats the tongue. One of the things I look for in a whiskey is the feel of the whiskey. So the taste is almost secondary to the way it feels on my palate. And a good whiskey it'll feel as if it coats your whole mouth.
Yeah.
Wild Turkey does that for me. Wild Turkey 101 does that for me.
Yeah, it's almost viscous is maybe like too strong of a description, but it is. It has viscosity.
Yes,
for sure.
And I love that. I love the feel of it. So this at this point, we've swallowed that whiskey, and now we're experiencing the finish. So the finish is what happens after we sip the whiskey. A good whiskey that's got that nice mouthfeel will typically have a long finish. So, and long finishes in whiskey terms is, a minute or two. You still have that nice experience. Some whiskeys, if you don't take another sip, you'll be tasting that for 10 or 15 minutes. That's
desirable.
Thing. Yes. Okay. Oh, good long finish. We don't like them when you sip them and they just disappear. So that amount of whiskey we poured, which, I poured maybe a half an ounce in there, an ounce or 2 ounce pour that I sip, and that'll take me 45 minutes or an hour just sitting there enjoying that whiskey to finish that little bit of whiskey.
Okay.
So I love long finishes. So now that one's gone, if you take another little sip, it'll have a different behavior on the tongue. We've kind of prepped the palate for whiskey. So if you take another sip, this is when you actually get to start tasting the flavors. This does result in a little bit of dead air for a podcast.
Because I'm not trying to guzzle it down and have something to say
sip on it and keep it on the tongue for a while and then let it down. And unlike a wine where you might open up and aerate, if you try and aerate some whiskey, you will often choke yourself. Yeah. But there's a thing called the Kentucky Chew that a lot of the old they'll do this. Kind of juggle the whiskey around your tongue, get a little air in there you don't really breathe in. It's kind of like cigar smoking. You don't really inhale it. You just kind of chew on it a little bit.
Yeah. I know it's a podcast and people can't see you, but you look like a very wise old bunny rabbit when you were doing that.
I'll take that.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the process. That's my process anyway. And now I'm going to sit and enjoy the finish of a whiskey. To me, in today's market, a $20, $23, $24, $5 bottle of whiskey that can check those boxes. It's got a lovely nose. It's got all the flavors I'm looking for, the sweetness. It's got a bite, a little spice on the back of it that comes from some of that rye grain that's in there. And then it has a lovely finish that goes on for a while. That's all the stuff I'm looking for in a whiskey.
And I'm not crazy going into the liquor store. Like, prices have gone way up.
Yes.
Okay. Maybe more than the average inflation points.
Yeah. And, today we say a bottle of Wild Turkey 101's an inexpensive, kind of even a bottom shelf whiskey at $20 something. This should really be a $12 bottle of whiskey at the most.
Okay.
Yeah. So what do you think of that? What do you think of Wild Turkey 101 bourbon?
It's good, and I've had it before, so it's not my first taste, but it really is like you're describing. It's a great baseline. It's clean, it's accessible, but it's not boring, and it doesn't feel rough. Like there are some whiskeys where you kind of they burn the back of your throat, and it's not doing that. So that's obviously a bonus. It's a great, reasonably priced whiskey.
There you go. And I think it's wonderful. And I will, one of the other things we were talking about is, I don't know if you actually said that, but you asked about fancy whiskey or ordering whiskey. But in bars, I'm not typical. I will not spend a lot of money on a pour of whiskey in a bar. And there's some logical reasons and there's some silly conspiracy theory reasons. The logical reasons are, as we sit here, I'm in my space. This is my house. It's my smells, and the environment can have a drastic effect on what I think of a whiskey. So the last thing I really want to do is spend $25 or $30 or $40 on a pour of nice whiskey in a place that's burning food in the back, that somebody just stepped out back to smoke a cigarette, that's got 14 people with perfume on it around me.
Dirty glasses.
Yeah, the funky glass, everything. Yeah. It's not the shape that I'm used to. And I know that's not typical, and it's not like I've never done that, and I certainly will sometimes. But what I know with my baseline whiskey is, if I'm in a bar, I can get a pour, even in a fancy restaurant, I can still get a nice pour of Wild Turkey for $8 or $9, and I know I'm going to like it. So I don't, because those environmental, and also because I don't trust, I don't mean this ugly, but I don't trust the establishment that what's supposed to be in that bottle is really in that bottle. So that's why I typically won't spend a lot of money in a bar.
Well, that's all good advice, because I wouldn't necessarily know the differences or the nuances between really high-end whiskeys. So while ordering them may make me feel special, I don't think I get the full value or benefit of spending, an extra, sometimes $10 on a really nice pour.
Yeah. So I agree with that.
So maybe this is blasphemy, but sometimes my whiskey drink is, so I like Jameson. I already mentioned that once, but it's just a nice, smooth, standard, reliable inexpensive choice. I have been known to order it on the rocks. Mm-hmm. How do you feel about straight or on the rocks? Does it matter by whiskey or?
I feel that you drink whiskey any way that it makes you happy. And even if I'm sharing whiskey. So if I'm willing to share whiskey with somebody, what they do with it is up to, I would love it if they would taste the whiskey first. You want to put some Coke in it? I don't care. That's your business. And wow. I got that from the prophet Booker No. Now, we haven't discussed Booker No. Booker is the grandson or the great-grandson of Jim Beam. And he is the guy that came up with this term small batch whiskey. Booker No himself said, the right way to drink whiskey is any damn way you please. So anybody that tells you there's an absolute right way to drink whiskey, don't hang out with those people. That's just wrong.
So if I come over to your house and you offer me one of your rarest, most treasured whiskeys, and I ask you for some ice cubes and a Diet Coke, you're not kicking me out of your house?
I'll ask you to take a little sip first and consider the whiskey itself, and then I'll pull one of my beautiful clear ice spheres out of the freezer and drop it in the glass and open the Diet Coke for you.
Those are pretty nice.
Yeah. Do you know what a Jack Daniels in Coca-Cola it's got a nickname for that, named after a musician. It's called a Lemmy, because Lemmy from Motorhead famously drank those for decades and decades.
Huh. Did not know that.
I'll admit something that my normal co-host Dan would fall over dead if I said this, but I have a single barrel Jack Daniels whiskey, a very nice single barrel, and in honor of Lemmy, not long ago, I had some leftover Coke from getting Chick-fil-A at lunch, and I made me a Lemmy. I poured some Coca-Cola over a $40 bottle of Jack Daniels whiskey.
Oh man, never has a more Southern thing been uttered.
Now, so I don't often drink whiskey over ice, but I will after I have a nice old fashioned, because those clear ice spheres melt very slowly. Mm-hmm. So after I have the old fashioned, there's a lot of ice left. And so I'll just splash a little whiskey on top. In fact, you may remember me talking about this. My dad drank Henry McKenna bourbon, and I always keep a bottle of the cheapest Henry McKenna on the shelf because it's the closest thing to what he would have drank. And that's the one I'll go grab and pour over the ice. And I quite enjoy it.
Yeah. Yeah, sometimes, especially like in the spring or summer, it's really nice, refreshing afternoon drink with like a sprig of mint in there.
Yeah,
pretty good.
Absolutely. And while we're talking about that, so on the rocks is the right way to say that, and straight's okay to say, but typically if we want just whiskey, we say whiskey neat. So neat means at whatever the temperature it happens to be in the bottle with no ice, just pour it in the glass. No extra things in it.
Well, neat. Thanks for the tip.
There you go. So when you order your wild turkey in a bar, you'll say, take some Wild Turkey 101 neat, please.
Yeah.
Cool.
And one more question on that. Are those it's like frozen rocks? Are those just gimmicks?
Those are horrid, terrible things that nobody should ever.
Okay.
Nobody should ever.
Glad I asked.
Why anybody put a rock in their glass like that? But look, I guess if they're nice and cold, they will cool the whiskey off. But if you want your whiskey cold over ice, just put it over ice. And I get it. People don't want to water down the whiskey.
Yeah.
Which is part of the reason you want to get the clear ice, because when ice is cloudy, it means there's air in it, and so it's less dense and it just melts quickly. But please don't use the whiskey rocks. Those are just not good. Again, my opinion. If you came to my house carrying some rocks and that's what you want in your glass, whatever, I'll pour the whiskey on the rocks. It's fine with me.
I look forward to visiting you with a pile of frozen rocks in my pocket.
What's next?
Well, you touched on this a little bit, but you gave me the option when we were planning for this podcast to look for Wild Turkey, either the bourbon or the rye version. Mm-hmm. They only had the bourbon version. I actually prefer rye if I'm given a choice. But what is the difference? What makes it either in taste or in composition? Why are they called different things?
It's got to do primarily with the makeup of the grain. So whiskey is a distilled product made from a mash of cereal grains. And in bourbon, the majority of that grain, at least 51%, has to be corn. The rest of it can be whatever grain you want. Typically it's rye. Sometimes the rye is swapped out for wheat. So you have corn, wheat, and malted barley. Those are called wheated bourbons. So a rye whiskey in the American whiskey world means the majority of the grains in that whiskey are rye. So it'll be at least 51% rye. And then the rest can be whatever. Typically it's some corn and some malted barley. So that's the reason it's a rye whiskey, or why. There's occasionally for different styles of whiskey, like there's a designation and a set of rules for anything. So corn whiskey's got its own designation, but that's the difference. So rye whiskey is majority rye in the grain. It's produced the same way. It has the same rules. It has to go, it can't come off the still any higher than 160 proof. It can't go in the barrel to age any more than 125 proof. And it has to be aged in an oak container. Doesn't actually even say barrel. It just says container. To my knowledge, nobody ages whiskey in boxes, but they could if they wanted to. And then once it's bottled, it's got to be bottled at least 80 proof to be a rye whiskey.
So as it ages, the proof comes down?
It depends on the environment. Sometimes, because they can go in the barrel at a maximum of 125 proof. And that's the cheapest way for them to do that. So Wild Turkey goes in a lower barrel proof, which is something I happen to like. I think that makes a better tasty whiskey. But it has to go in at least 125. Some whiskeys will go up in proof over time. Some come down. It has to do with the environment, the warehouse they're in, the humidity, the location, et cetera. Yeah. And then the other question of, what tastes different? Well, it's a lot like, think about bread, think about the grains themselves. So if you were to eat corn, it tastes a certain way. And a lot of that gets distilled out of it, but there's still the essence of that grain. And so the higher the rye content, the more it's going to taste like rye bread. It gets that spiciness on the end of it, the baking spice kind of thing. Corn doesn't actually have a lot of flavor when it gets distilled, and they actually will refer to the rye or the wheat or the malted barley as the flavoring grains. So one of the things interesting about rye whiskey is because the grain itself has more flavor, you can often get a tastier whiskey that's a rye whiskey at a younger age because there's just more flavor from the start. It doesn't need as much from the barrel.
That makes sense.
That help?
Yeah, I definitely like rye bread more than white bread. So
yeah, and in any whiskey, there's always a raging debate. How much of the flavor is coming from the barrel and the wood, and how much is coming from the distillate in the first place? So there's still as those arguments rage. It's still acknowledged that most of it's coming from the barrel. So 70 to 80% of that flavor and all of the color, bourbons and ryes are not supposed to have any added color. All of that flavor, a lot of the flavors come in from the barrel itself, but you still taste that influence of a high rye whiskey will have that spicier flavor and be less sweet than something that's more heavier weighted towards corn.
Interesting. So when you walk through the liquor store now and you see all these newfangled options for different, just weird leftover, like apple brandy barrel aged whiskey or whatever they're calling it, that's because they're taking a barrel that was used for something else and putting whiskey in it and using that flavor to change the whiskey. Yeah,
that's called finishing. So if it's going to be called bourbon or rye or American single malt, it has to be aged in a new barrel. So the first thing it has to spend its life in is a new charred oak container. Okay. There's no rule about how long it has to stay in there. So finishing will happen after that. So it'll have its initial maturation in a new barrel. And then at some point they'll find that apple brandy thing you were talking about, and they'll pour that whiskey in that apple brandy barrel and call that bourbon finished in an apple brandy cask or barrel. Okay. It's one of those things where done well, it can add some lovely interest to a whiskey. Done poorly, it just bastardizes the whole thing, in my opinion. And frankly, I don't really think it's correct to call something bourbon finished in. The rules of bourbon are very clear. No extra anything. Grain, water, yeast, thyme, wood barrel, end of story. I don't mind it being a finished whiskey, but I think you can unbourbon something at some point. But that's how the finishing thing works. And it's very, very popular now. And people will finish all sorts of stuff. And some of the brands, that's all they do. Angel's Envy. You ever seen Angel's Envy whiskey on the shelf?
I don't think so.
Everything they do is finished. That's kind of their thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So it doesn't make it bad. Just makes it different.
Bastardized.
Some of it's awesome.
No negative connotation there.
It is. Well, there is. I'm biased against it because so few distilleries do it well. But if you ever want to taste a wonderful example of that and you don't mind dropping $100, Barrel Bourbon has quite a few finished, but they have one called Dovetail that is always very good. And it's a mixture of, it's Indiana bourbon or whiskey and Kentucky bourbon finished in rum barrels and what else? I can't remember the other thing it's finished in. It's delicious. But finishing should be an accent. Should be a small, ooh, what did I just taste? Not, holy crap, this tastes like apple juice. That's bad.
Yeah. No bueno.
No bueno.
Okay. Well, I have one from left field.
Bring it on.
So I'm a nerd and a grammar and word nerd, to be specific. Whiskey is often spelled with an E or without an E. Mm-hmm. What is the difference? Which one's right? Is there a right or wrong?
Nope. It's come down to countries. So Scotch whiskey and Japanese whiskey typically won't use the E. Irish whiskey and American whiskey will use the E, but even that's not consistent. George Dickel whiskey does not use the E because George Dickel thought his whiskey was as good as any Scotch whiskey, so he doesn't use it. Maker's Mark bourbon does not use the E. So it's just
it's a free for all.
Yep.
Just making shit up.
Yep. So it could be, it's kind of like color. Color has a U in it in Great Britain. Does not have a U in it here. Why? I don't know.
Well, that was my favorite question. Speaking of words that have inconsistent spellings between countries. It was not a very satisfying answer.
I'm sorry.
The answer is arbitrary.
There's just nothing to it.
It's not your fault. Just, I remain unsatisfied.
Let's take a break and return to the whiskey for a second.
Okay.
So the reason I had you bring some water is what the distiller decided to put in the bottle at a particular proof doesn't mean that's the way it has to stay.
Okay.
Right. And the reason we have there's a great popularity with cask strength whiskey. So we're going to bottle that whiskey at whatever it comes out of the barrel at. So 120, 125, 130 proof whiskeys are very popular these days. And some people feel like they have to drink it however it came out of the bottle or however it came out of the barrel. And that's just wrong. That's back to that thing about you drink it how you want. Interestingly, whiskey will change drastically how it smells and tastes with just a tiny little bit of water. And I think that's fascinating. So if your glass is empty, let's pour a little more whiskey in there.
What if my glass isn't yet empty?
Well, then you've already got some whiskey.
Okay.
I could
add some more.
Sure. She drags the bottle across the table.
Oops. I didn't want to be left out.
I just love the smell of bourbon.
Best noise.
Didn't it? Glug, 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 glug. Mm. So you had a little spoon. I'm going to show you how much water I'm going to put in mine. It's very, very little. So it's about like that. So I've got less than an ounce. I put a tiny little bit in there. There you go.
You don't have one of those very fancy shooter straws that you have.
Melissa bought a pile of them. It came in a little black felt bag for like $3. So Straws are handy, Fred. Just a little bit of whiskey. So give it a little swirl and sniff that and see if you sniff any differences.
Might be psychosomatic, but it smells less potent.
Mine picks up a little grassy, kind of grainy nose to it.
Really? Just from that little bit of water?
Yeah, it's less sweet to me.
Yeah. Like mellow.
Yeah. So the purpose of this exercise is back to that how you want thing. So for some people, 101 proof is a lot of proof. Mm-hmm. It's very proofy, and it could be too much. So if it is, drop a little water in it. And if that helps, great. If it doesn't, drop a little more water in it. you will find there's a point at which, and it varies by whiskey and it even varies by my mood. There's a point at which I've added too much water and now it's got no body left to it. So you don't want to do that.
Well, this may be an offshoot, but so the 101 is obviously, like you just said, a higher proof. I listed some of the whiskeys that I have in my bar, and you don't have any of those, and you suggested that we go with this. I remember many, many moons ago being in your house and you telling me that you didn't think maybe we were shopping for whiskey. We were either at your house sipping whiskey or we were taking one of our lunchtime trips to the whiskey store next to the sandwich place. The whiskey store, the liquor store. And you made a comment that you didn't generally buy whiskey under a certain proof because it wasn't worth it.
Yep.
I feel like Basil Hayden's was on that list.
Yeah, it is.
Okay. Do I need to rephrase that question since I just made an absolute mess of it?
No, that's absolutely right. So there's, one of the many opinions I hold about whiskey, and I think that people tend to generate over time, is they'll find a proof range that works for them for different whiskeys. The issue I have with 80 proof whiskeys, which is the minimum it can be, it's got to be at least 80 proof to be a bourbon or a rye whiskey, is it's just hard to have a lot of flavor left at that point. Because remember, most of these distillers, for profit's sake, are going to come off the still as high a proof as they can. That's the most economical thing. They're going to put it in the barrels at as high a proof as they can in order to get it down to 80 proof. So it ages for how many years? It's 111 proof. They got to get it to 80. They get it there with water. They proof that down with water. Okay. So there's just not typically, and I'm going to say typically because there's always an exception. Typically with a bourbon, there's just not a lot of flavor and body left in the whiskey at 80 proof. And that's kind of my issue with Basil Hayden. I don't mind the flavor at all of Basil Hayden. If it was a $17 or $18 bottle, I'd probably buy it once in a while. But it's a $50-something bottle at 80 proof with an undisclosed age. That's just not something I'm interested in. But I will buy Old Grandad a lot. Old Grandad is also a Jim Beam product, which happens to use the exact same mash bill and is pretty much the same whiskey produced at the same time, put in the barrels the same way. It just doesn't quite get as old sometimes, and it's in different parts of the warehouse. But I can buy a bottle of Old Grandad bottled and bond at 100 proof for $20. So if I want the Jim Beam high rye mash bill, it's different than Jim Beam whiskey or Knob Creek. They use a different recipe for those two whiskeys. So if I want that high rye experience from Jim Beam instead of Basil Hayden, I'll buy Old Grandad. Bottled and bond or Old Grandad 114. They have a 114 proof version of Old Grandad. Delicious. $27. But that's my thing with proof. And I'm not a proof hound. I'm not one of those people. There's a lot of current whiskey geeks that have come on quickly that will not drink anything if it's not 120 proof. That's ridiculous to me.
That's very strong.
Sometimes, depending on the whiskey, sometimes it's funny. Whiskey's funny. So there are some 120 proof whiskeys that will absolutely blow your head off when you try and drink them neat. And then there's some that you sip and you'd swear they're not more than 90 proof. And for the life of me, I don't know how that works or why some of them are that way, but there are whiskeys that are very proofy that just don't drink that way. And that's why I want to taste the whiskey as it is. And then I'll decide myself if that's a good proof. And if it's not for me and it needs to be lower, I don't have a qualm in the world about putting water in it. I wouldn't, if somebody said, it's a little hot, I'm going to put some ice in it. Great, put some ice in it. Let the ice melt and bring that proof down. If that's what makes it an enjoyable whiskey for you, do it 100%. Yeah. So the alcohol carries a lot of the flavor.
Okay.
So I'm super happy with whiskeys in the 90 to 110 proof. There's some at 130 that just drink delicious. And some nights one whiskey one night could kill you. Next night you can drink it neat, no problem. We're a weird little beast that way. It changes based on our mood and our environment. And, one of the things you were asking about is, I know it's a little bit tongue in cheek, but is whiskey better in the company of interesting people? Absolutely. A whiskey that you open up and drink and think, that's just terrible. But if you have it with a bunch of good friends, it tastes wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah, this wild turkey is some of the best I've ever had. because I'm in good company.
There you go. There you go.
Yeah.
Fun.
Well, I have learned a lot. Is there anything else that we should cover before we wrap it up?
I don't think so. I want to save some. I want to do this again. This has been enjoyable. Okay. I hope people, had the same questions and we answer some of them. If we did, let us know in the comments. Some of these little snippets will be on YouTube as well. So you'll get to see us drinking and the glasses we used and that kind of stuff. But let us know what those questions are. And if I got something wrong or you disagree, that's great. Again, it's a subjective sport. So let us know those things too. I don't think we should push it, Stacey. I think we'll turn the recording off and maybe sip a little more. And then we'll do this again soon and talk some more about whiskey.
Okay. And if anybody has a better answer for the E versus no E answer, then throw that in the comments too.
Clearly, you do not believe my answer.
I believe you. I just want a more creative. Now people can just make shit up. Just make something up to make me happy.
How about this? So Scottish people, the way Gaelic rolls off the tongue, they don't have E's in the end of words that end in Y. That's a rule. It's like I before E except after C. That's a Gaelic thing. That's why they don't use the E. Is that better?
Okay. No.
No? Because I told you the truth first.
Valiant effort, though.
This has been absolutely enjoyable. I hope everybody enjoyed it. Let us know. Follow us on the socials at The Practical Still. thepractical.com is a great place to find everything. The YouTube channel, we don't do as many of these podcasts as we used to, but boy, we keep the YouTube channel going. So check out those videos. We do open the bottle videos where I'll open up a brand new bottle, give you a quick take on what I think of it. And then I go back to the bottle in a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks and tell you what changed, because believe it or not, they do change a lot. Stacey, I thought you'd ask me about that, what happens after a bottle's open, but you didn't.
Next time, I'm saving it.
But they do change. So we do the back to the bottle videos. We do a Friday Sips Live almost every week. Dan and I sit around in the world headquarters, Dan's garage. We drink some whiskey. We talk about it live and chat with the folks that join us. So join us that if you can, because you're not working on Friday afternoon. Nobody works at 3 o'clock on Friday. Why not sip some whiskey, or at least watch me sip whiskey? And if you have questions, let us know. Stacey, thank you so much for hanging out with me. Harvey did great. I didn't even hear that puppy tweet at all.
Just snoring quietly. You might have to edit him out, but good.
Yeah, he was awesome. He's a good whiskey puppy.
Yes, he is.
Cool. All right. Thanks for joining us. Talk to you next time.